Syria's growing cycle of violence. Is this country in a state of quasi-civil war or about to start a civil war? If this current regime falls from power, what could replace it? And how should the international community act? Crosstalk Syria's future. I'm joined by Mark Levine in Washington. He's a senior fellow with the Truman National Security Project and a talk radio host. In Cambridge, we cross to George Joffe. He is a research fellow at King's College London. And in Detroit, we go to Abayomi Asikiwa. He is a journalist and political analyst. All right, folks, crosstalk rules in effect. That means that you can spend any time you want, and I really encourage it. But first, let's see how the world has been reacting to events in Syria.
As protests in Syria continue unabated, up to 3,000 people, most of whom are civilians, are already thought to have died in the government's crackdown. Despite this, the international community has in effect ignored the bloodshed, opting instead for sanctions and rhetorical orations.
I think that increasingly you're seeing President Assad lose legitimacy in the eyes of his people. And that's why we've been working at an international level to make sure that we keep the pressure up to see if we can bring some real change in Syria.
But unlike NATO's aerial campaign in Libya, Syrian protesters have been largely left to fend for themselves. And that despite Syrian protesters' calls on the international community to interfere.
The Syrian people call on the United Nations to adopt a resolution to set up a permanent observer mission in Syria.
And yet there's been no UN resolution of the sorts. Experts say one of the reasons for the lack of action is President Bashar Assad's military arsenal, which far outweighs that of Muammar Gaddafi's. Some politicians, such as France's foreign minister, have also pointed the finger at Russia, which opposed foreign intervention in Libya and is likely to veto a UN resolution of condemnation against the Syrian government.
Our objective is to obtain a resolution at the Security Council condemning the use of violence against civilians and organizing a regime of sanctions. Hard struggle, but we do not give up.
But most importantly, the Syrian question seems to be about the clash of competing interests over Syria's diverse ethnic and religious makeup. So far, the struggle for reform in the embattled country has resembled a playing field for regional powers like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran, with few in the West willing to provoke the latter. Masha Charney for Crosstalk, RT.
Okay, first I'd like to start with George in Cambridge. The mainstream media is looking at Syria as just the slaughter of innocent civilians, innocent protesters, but a little bit deeper description would probably be this is an armed insurrection because we have members of the security forces and presumably the military that are taking casualties. Why do you think it's being reported as simply as just Assad's government attacking protesters when some of these protesters obviously appear to be armed?
Well, I think the short answer is that at the moment, the majority of people demonstrating are unarmed. Okay. And so you can argue that it's a peaceful demonstration. But the problem is that you're quite right. There are arms amongst the demonstrators in some parts of the country. The demonstrations have really been armed, and there have been massacres of security forces as well. So the problem is whether or not the demonstrations overall do become an armed insurrection. And should that occur, then I think the outcome in Syria is going to be very bloody indeed.
Okay, Mark, if I can go to you. Would you call this a civil war? That it's beginning, it may be a civil war now, and a civil war that could just continue to develop over time? Because it looks like the Assad government regime is not going to give up very easily. It's shown that.
Well, it's true that the government, it represents a tiny minority, the Alawite population in Syria. And to that extent, that the majority Sunni want to have a voice in their country, it could become a civil war. Right now, though, it's a bunch of innocent, pacifist people. The vast majority of them have no arms, who are trying to fight to have a voice. All I have to do is look at today's Washington Post. This is a picture of Giyat Matar. This is a pacifist. This is a young man, not 25 years old, who used to hand roses to the soldiers who were mowing down protesters, trying to get them to stop. He, unfortunately, was just murdered, tortured, brutalized, along with 3,600 innocent people in Syria. Right now, it's just people fighting to have a voice in their country and being brutalized by their own government.
Abiami, in Detroit, how would you describe the event playing out in Syria right now? Would you call it a civil war? An armed insurrection?
I think it is I believe it is the beginning of a civil war. There are elements there that are armed. The Syrian government has pointed out that the opposition, certain elements within the opposition have been armed. by outside forces, particularly the United States as well as Israel. They claim that they have a confession from a former general from Syria who defected, and he's going to be featured on Syrian television very soon to talk about the involvement of the United States and Israel in this overall unrest that's been taking place in Syria now for the last several months. We have to keep in mind that Syria is one of the countries that has been targeted for several years now by the U.S. and by other Western powers for regime change. And the people who are calling for the imposition of a no-fly zone and for international intervention have to keep in mind that this has not helped the situation at all in Libya. We just need to take Libya as a playbook. We've had the bombing of Libya now for over 6 months. And the situation there, the conditions are deplorable for the civilian population. It's divided the people of Libya. And we do not want to see the same situation develop in Syria, because it's going to be the United States and these Western industrialized countries and the populations within these Western industrialized countries going to be victimized by this war that they're planning to carry out against the Syrian government.
Okay, so I see Mark. I see Mark in Washington. You disagree very much. Mark, go right ahead. That's what this program's all about. Go ahead.
I hardly know where to begin. The Syrian people would be lucky to join the Libyan people and the Tunisian people and the Egyptian people in freedom. They would be lucky to get rid of their dictator who's already murdered 3,600 innocent civilians. His father killed tens of thousands in Hama. And if the Syrian government is on the up and up, and frankly, I don't know anyone who believes the Syrian government. Not only do Syrians not believe the Syrian government, I don't know any nation in the world who takes a serious word the Syrian government says. If they are telling the truth, then allow the media into Syria, allow the media into the squares, allow the media to see the troops mowing down innocent people like pacifists, people who hand out roses to soldiers. If they don't allow the media in because they know they can massacre and torture and brutalize a lot more people if they don't allow the media in. Nobody believes the Syrian government, not even, in fact, the people in the Syrian government.
What do you think about that, George? I mean, we heard earlier that the United States and other countries, and Israel was mentioned, have an interest in seeing Syria being unstable, excuse me.
Well, I have to say I find a confusion of truth and misunderstanding there quite extraordinary. As far as I know, it's certainly true that the United States has, for many years now, called for the Syrian government to be overthrown or modified. And it's also true that there has been some evidence that the American government has begun unofficially to encourage armed insurrection inside Syria. But to suggest that Israel would do so, I do find strange. Not because I believe that Israel is not capable of doing so, but because actually it doesn't serve Israel's interest to do so. If indeed it gets rid of the Syrian government, it disturbs a stable situation inside the Middle East, which has been to its benefit for a very long time. And it's got no guarantee that what will come instead would be more acceptable to it, almost certainly be less so. You only have to look at the situation that's developed in Egypt, that's developing in Jordan, and it's what's occurred in Turkey to see that. So I really don't think you can lump together the Israeli government with the United States in that respect. And then beyond that too, the idea of an external intervention of the kind that occurred in Libya doesn't seem to me to be in the remotest sense possible, likely, or to be encouraged. And to suggest that in fact the intervention in Libya was to the disadvantage of the Libyan people, when the Gaddafi regime was, if possible, more brutal than that President Assad, seems to me to be quite simply ludicrous.
What do you think? Let's go back to Detroit. What do you think about that? I mean, it doesn't seem to be in everyone's interest to see a regime fall apart. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of other issues involved. We have Iran, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Hezbollah. It's extremely complicated. I mean, Assad is the devil you know in the region, and a lot of people are quite satisfied with that.
Well, the fact of the matter is that there's an alliance between the Syrian government, the government in Iran, Hezbollah, the resistance movement in Lebanon, as well as Hamas in Palestine. And these are the sworn enemies of the United States, as well as the Western industrialized countries along with Israel. Israel operates as the forward operating base of U.S. interests in the Middle East. You cannot lump the developments in Egypt and Tunisia in with what has happened in Libya and Syria, for the simple fact that the governments in Egypt and Tunisia have long been supported by the United States, and to a certain degree are supported by them today as well. We had the Egyptian Special Forces that operated with the NTC in Libya in order to topple the Gaddafi government in Libya. Also, we have the situation in Tunisia where the armed forces there assisted the NTC and NATO forces in destabilizing Libya. And it does not serve the interests of the Syrian people or any other people in the region to have a direct U.S. and Western involvement in their countries. The Arab League has been attempting to mediate the situation inside of Syria. The Secretary General of the Arab League, Mr. Nabil El-Arabi, was in Damascus about 5 days ago. And this is what needs to be encouraged. There needs to be an encouragement of dialogue.
All right. Gentlemen, I'm going to jump in right here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT.